The Years of Detention, Chapter 2, Imprisoned in My Own Home. My mother and I were released from Sahala at the end of May 1979, 7 weeks after my father's death. We returned to 70 Clifton, our family home in Karachi. Everything was the same, but nothing was the same. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, bar at law, read the brass nameplate beside the gate to 70 Clifton. Above it was another brass plate, faded with time, inscribed with my grandfather's name, Sir Shah Nawaz Bhutto. My grandmother built this two-story sprawling bungalow shortly after I was born in 1953, and my brothers, sisters, and I grew up here in the cooling breezes from the Arabian Sea just a quarter of a mile away. Who would have foreseen the tragedy and violence that would overtake this peaceful family compound? Every day, hundreds of wailing mourners mass in the garden of coconut palms, mangoes, and red and yellow flowering trees coaxed from the desert of Karachi. Hundreds more wait patiently outside the gates to pay condolence calls to their leader's family. My mother is still in Iddat and can't receive outsiders. She sends me to greet them instead. The familiarity of being at home makes our nightmare seem even more unreal. 2 nights before my father was hanged, the staff tell us the army raided 70 Clifton for the second time, searching the roof and the garden, opening my mother's safe, rifling through the clothes in my father's cupboards. Do you have a search warrant? One of the staff had asked, still clinging to the concept of civil law. I am with the search party, so there's no need for a warrant, claimed the army officer who had come with the police. For 10 hours, they had torn the house apart, taking many of my personal letters from my bedroom and 2 black briefcases containing bank orders and canceled checks, evidence I had collected to refute the regime's trumped up charges of corruption against my father. There are secret cupboards and passages here. Show them to us, the army officers commanded the staff, then beat them when they said there were none. As the search wore on, the servants were taken to the reception room and locked in. When the milkman came early in the morning, he was locked in with them. So was the man who came with the newspapers. The army was getting desperate. Sign this paper, an officer said to one of our staff. He refused. You've seen what happened to your sahib. The officer threatened him. If you don't sign, imagine what will happen to you. The man was so frightened that he signed. When the search turned out to be fruitless, a truck rumbled through the gate. The soldiers unloaded a red carpet, covered it with documents that also came from the trunk, and then brought in the press to photograph the new evidence against my father. Many assumed the regime was trying to build another case against my father in view of the Supreme Court's unanimous recommendation to commute the death sentence against him to life imprisonment. When the raiding party left in the late afternoon, they took their evidence with them, as well as many of our personal possessions, among them my father's collection of antique maps. At 70 Clifton now, I make preparations to go to Larkana to pay my respects at my father's grave. The regime learns of my plan and cancels the scheduled flights, so I take the train. Massive crowds meet me at every station. Where there were no stations, they lie across the track, forcing the train to halt. Revenge, revenge, the crowds shout. We must turn our grief to strength to beat Zaya at the polls. I tell them, encouraged by the huge turnout. The crowds are the best answer to our political opponents who had publicly declared that Bhutto's strength has been buried in his grave and along with that of the PPP. Back in Karachi, I meet PPP leaders and supporters at 10-minute intervals from 9 in the morning until 9 at night. Every few hours, I take a break to meet my father's mourners in the garden. Their eyes brighten when they see me, and my mother as well, after a period of seclusion is over. The people did not expect either of us to survive our periods of detention or my father's death. We have lived a softer, more privileged life than their harsh ones, but seeing us with their own eyes seems to fill them with new hope. As one group leaves the garden, another enters. At night, I immerse myself in organizational matters, policy matters, complaints, and political arrests, having summaries prepared for my mother to read. I feel I'll never catch up and probably wouldn't have without the help of my school friend Samaya and also of Amina and Yasmin, 2 young women who have become my friends and aides during the first fight to appeal against my father's death sentence. The Western press dubbed Samaya, Amina, and Yasmin Charlie's Angels, though I'm sure the real Charlie's Angels would have given up under the workload. One night I fall asleep with the report in my lap. The next night I move my toothbrush and toothpaste into my study. To calm the people before he ordered my father's death, General Zia had again promised elections that would return the country from his military dictatorship to civilian rule. But was he going to let the PPP win? He had publicly declared that he would not hand power to those he had taken it from, and that only elections with positive results would be acceptable to him. Zia had been in this predicament before when he scheduled elections shortly after he overthrew my father in 1977. Faced with the PPP's certain victory at the polls, his answer then had been to cancel the elections and arrest all the party leaders instead. What would he do this time? The local elections came first in September. The PPP sweeps them. The national elections are to come next, the election Zia desperately needs to win to gain legitimacy. Knowing that the rules are likely to be rigged against PPP, our own party officials meet at 70 Clifton to debate whether or not to enter the national elections or boycott them instead. Electoral fields should never be left open, I argue, remembering what my father had told me. No matter how heavy the odds, no matter how crooked the rules, always mount an opposition, and the rules certainly are crooked. Just as we expect, Zia changes them as soon as the PPP decision to participate is announced. Register as a political party or you can't participate, the regime informs us. We refuse. To register is to recognize Zia's military regime. We'll run as independents, we counter, though we realize the loss of our party emblem on the ballots is a great risk in society, with an official literacy rate of 27% and an actual rate closer to 8%. The regime raises the stakes. Independent candidates must secure 51% of the popular vote, the new rule says. Fine, we say, we'll carry it. But on October 15, 1979, a month before the elections are scheduled to take place, the PPP reconvenes at the request of some high-ranking party officials. The question of fighting the elections is reopened, and the party splits down the middle. Boycott, boycott, several of the party officials urged my mother in the dining room of 70 Clifton, now serving as a conference room. Some of them, I know, have called me a silly little girl in private, but I speak up again. By continually changing the rules, Zia has lost his confidence, I argue. We must not lose our. We swept the local bodies' elections, and we will sweep the general election too. It is late at night before the PPP decides by a narrow margin to uphold the decision to contest. When Zia hears of our intention the next day, his nerve cracks. The Chief Martial Law Administrator repeats the pattern of 1977, canceling the elections altogether and once again sending his soldiers to 70 Clifton. The house is surrounded, one of the staff tells me in the middle of the night. Quickly, I gather all the political papers I had laboriously collected. Party papers, membership lists, letters, lists of those in jail, throw them in the bath and burn them. I don't want to make the regime's persecution easier. Minutes later, the soldiers enter the house to take my mother and me at gunpoint to Al Mortaza, our country home in Larkana. We will be imprisoned there for 6 months. I pace the corridors of Al Mortaza, though this is my mother's 9th political detention and my 7th since a coup 2 years ago. I still can't adjust to the forced isolation. Each incarceration is just adding another layer of anger. Perhaps at 26, it is my age, but I don't think I would feel differently at any age, especially being detained at Al Mortaza. Al Mortaza was the heart of our family, the house to which we always returned from the 4 corners of the earth to pass our winter vacations, to celebrate Eid at the day of the holy month of Ramadan, as well as my father's birthday, to attend family weddings or pay condolences to our many relatives living on the lands that had been in the family for hundreds of years. Now the regime has declared Al Mortaza a sub-jail for my mother and me. The Western press is being told by the regime that we are under house arrest, but that is inaccurate. House arrest in Pakistan is quite informal, the detained person being allowed visits from friends and family, press interviews, local and long-distance cell phone calls, books, and sometimes even a quick drive or outside meeting. Under sub-jail rules, Al Mortaza has been deemed a prison while the jail manual regulations prevail. Our telephone is disconnected. My mother and I are confined to the compound and allowed no visitors except for an occasional visit from Sanam. The house, both inside and outside the walls, is surrounded by soldiers from the Frontier Force, a paramilitary group of Pathan tribesmen from the northwest frontier province. In my father's time, special commandos were posted at Al Mortaza to keep intruders out. The Frontier Force is here now for the sole purpose of keeping his widow and his daughter in. Zia wants the country, even the world, to forget that there was ever a family named Bhutto. In Pakistan, the papers hardly even mention our names. From October 16th, 1979, the day Zia canceled the second elections and arrested my mother and me, he added to his uh, Bergian list of martial law regulations by imposing total censorship on the press. Under Martial Law Order Number 49, the editor of any publication deemed dangerous to the sovereignty, integrity, and security of Pakistan, morality, and maintenance of public order is now subject to 10 lashes and 25 years of rigorous imprisonment. Our party newspaper, Musawat, with a circulation of over 100,000 in the city of Lahore alone, has been closed down and its presses seized. Other newspapers are being threatened with closure or the cut off of government controlled newsprint and advertising if they do not comply. For the next 6 years, pictures of my father, mother, or me will rarely appear in any newspaper, nor will there be any favorable mention of our names. If the military censors find any story even slightly sympathetic, they will cut it out of the galleys. Each newspaper is required to submit for approval. At times, whole newspaper columns will run blank, the journalist's method of letting the reading public know that news worthy of being printed has been removed by the censors. The strength of the PPP has also forced Zia to tighten his already oppressive political restrictions. Since the imposition of martial law in 1977, anyone participating in political activity had been subject to imprisonment and whipping. But from October 16, 1979, the military regime decreed that political parties themselves were illegal, a clear attempt to kill popular support for my father's policies once and for all. All political parties in Pakistan, with all their groups, branches, and factions, shall cease to exist. General Zia's Martial Law Order Number 48 stated bluntly. Any member of a political party or anyone who even calls himself one in private conversation is now subject to 14 years rigorous imprisonment, the loss of his property, and 25 lashes. From that moment on, any mention of the PPP in the press will be preceded by the word defunct. My mother and I are thus reduced to the defunct leaders of a defunct party and a defunct democracy. Photographs of my grandfather at the 1931 Indian Round Table Conference in London. Photographs of my father's annual birthday celebrations. So much of our family history is rooted in Al Murtaza. My father and his three sisters were born here. The midwife from the nearby village of Larkana coming to the women's quarters built by my grandfather to deliver them. Though the old house has been replaced by a more modern one, the sense of Al Murtaza as the true home of the Bhuttos remain. Blue and white tiles flank the front door, depicting the men and women of Mohenjo-daro, a nearby ruin of a highly advanced Indus civilization dating from 2500 BC. As a small child, I thought the ancient city was called Mohenjo-daro, which in Sindhi means my place. My brother, sister, and I took great pride that we had been raised in the shadow of Mohenjo-daro, that we lived on the bank of the Indus, which had been bringing life to the land since the beginnings of time. In no other place did we feel such continuity with the past, for our ancestors were directly traceable to the Muslim invasion of India in 712 AD. The diaries of one of our ancestors giving details about the family were washed away in a great flood in my great-grandfather's time. But as children, we were told that we were either descended from the Rajputs, the Hindu warrior class of India, which converted to Islam at the time of the Muslim invasion, or from the conquering Arabs who entered India through our home province of Sindh, giving it the name the gateway to Islam. Hundreds of thousands throughout India and Pakistan belong to the Bhutto tribe, one of the largest in Sindh, whose members range from farmers to landowners. Our branch of the family was directly descended from the famous tribal chief of the Bhuttos, Sardar Dodo Khan. Several villages in Upper Sindh, Mirpur Bhutto, where Uncle Mumtaz's family live. Gari Kuddo Baksht Bhutto, where my own family graveyard is located, are named for our ancestors who had owned much of the land in the province and dominated its politics for hundreds of years. My immediate family retained a house near Gari Kuddo Baksht Bhutto in Naudero, where my father and brothers used to go on Eid days to offer guests the traditional holiday fare of rice cooked with sugar cane and water flavored with flower petals. But since my father's time, the true center of the family had been in Larkana at Al Murtaza. Before the first land reforms in 1958, the Bhuttos were among the largest employers of agriculture workers in the province. Our lands, like those of other landowners in Sindh, were measured in square miles, not acres. As children, you loved to hear the story of the amazement of Charles Napier, the British conqueror of Sindh in 1843. Whose lands are these? He repeatedly asked his driver as he toured the province. Bhutto's lands, came the inevitable response. Wake me up when we are off Bhutto's lands, he ordered. He was surprised when some time later he woke up on his own. Who owns this land? He asked. Bhutto, the driver repeated. Napier became famous for his dispatch in Latin to the British military command after he conquered the province. Pavaki, I have sinned. As children we thought it a confession, not a pun. My father loved to recount other family stories. Your great grandfather, Mir Ghulam Murtaza Bhutto, was a handsome and dashing man of around 21. My father would begin one of our favorite stories. All the women in Sindh were in love with him, including a young British woman. In those days, it was haram, forbidden, to marry a foreigner, but he wouldn't prevent her feelings for him. A certain British Army official, Colonel Mayhew, heard about this forbidden relationship and sent for your great grandfather. It did not matter to the British officer that he was in Larkana, the hometown of the Bhuttos. It did not matter to him that the Bhutto land stretched farther than the eye could see. The British had little respect for our family heritage. All they saw was our brown skin. How dare you encourage the affections of a British woman, the colonel warned Ghulam Murtaza when your great-grandfather stood before him. I'm going to have to teach you a lesson, and the colonel picked up a whip. But as the colonel raised his hand to lash Ghulam Murtaza, your great-grandfather seized the whip and lashed the officer instead. Screaming for help, the colonel sought refuge under a table until Ghulam Murtaza strode out of the office. You must escape, Ghulam Murtaza's family and friends urged him. The British will kill you. So your great-grandfather left Larkana, accompanied by some companions and the British woman who insisted on leaving with him. The British were soon in hot pursuit. Split up, Ghulam Murtaza ordered his companions. One group come with me, the rest of you go with the English woman. But no one account let her be taken by the British. It is a matter of honor. And off they galloped in different directions, crisscrossing the river Indus to deceive the pursuing British. The British moved perilously close to the party with the British woman, for she could not travel with the speed of her great-grandfather. To fool them, the men dug a tunnel to hide in and covered the entrance with leaves. When the British found the tunnel, your great-grandfather's friends became desperate. They had promised Ghulam Murtaza they would not hand the girl over to the British. They could not face the dishonor of surrendering her to the enemy. Just before the British reached the woman, your great-grandfather's retinue killed her. Our eyes were wide by this point, but the story had just begun. Our great-grandfather escaped into the independent state of Bawalpur, but after the British threatened to seize the state, my great-grandfather thanked the Nawab for his hospitality and crossed the Indus again to gain sanctuary in the kingdom of Afghanistan, where he was a guest of the royal family. In fury, the British had seized all his lands. Our family home was auctioned. Our silk carpets were auctioned. Our sofas made of the imported silks, satins, and velvets of the old days. Our plates made of pure gold and silver. The huge cooking pots used to cook for thousands of family followers on religious holidays. The embroidered tents set up for celebrations were all sold. Ghulam Murtaza had to be punished and punished severely, for it was unthinkable for anyone to defy the British. They were like gods. In parts of India, natives were not allowed to walk the same street. They could not answer back to a British person, let alone strike one. Finally, a compromise was worked out with the British, and Ghulam Murtaza returned to Larkana, but his days were numbered. He became ill and began to lose weight. The hakims, or village doctors, suspected poison through one of, though no one could find the source. Your great-grandfather had tasters to test his food and drinking water, but the poisoning continued until it killed him at the early age of 27. Afterwards, the source was found to be his hookah, the water pipe he had used to smoke tobacco after dinner. I loved hearing these family stories, as did my brothers Mir Murtaza and Shah Nawaz, who naturally identified with their namesake. The adversaries faced by our ancestors formed our own moral code, just as my father had intended: loyalty, honor, principle. Ghulam Murtaza Bhutto's son, my grandfather, Sir Shah Nawaz, was the first to start breaking the Bhuttos away from the feudal ethos that was stifling a whole segment of society. Until his time, the Bhuttos had only married other Bhuttos, first cousins or possibly second. Islam entitled women to inherit property, and the only way to keep the land within the family was through marriage. Such a business arrangement had been arranged between my father and his cousin Amir when he was only 12 and she 8 or 9 years old. He had resisted until my grandfather tempted him with a cricket set from England. After their marriage, Amir had returned to live with her family and my father had returned to school, leaving him with a lasting impression of the inequality, especially as far as women were concerned, of forced family marriages. At least Amir had married. When there was no suitable cousin in the family, the Bhutto woman did not marry at all. For this reason, my aunts, my grandfather's daughters from his first marriage, had remained single all their lives. Despite great opposition from the family, the grandfather allowed his daughters from his second marriage to marry outside the Bhutto circle, though they were not love matches but strictly arranged affairs. A generation later, my sister Sanam would become the first Buddha woman to make her own decision. Contrary to my expectations, I would follow the traditional path and have an arranged marriage myself. Still, my grandfather was considered very progressive. He educated his children, even sending his daughters to school, an act that was considered scandalous by the other landowners. Many feudal landowners did not even bother to educate their sons. My sons have land, they have a guaranteed income, and will never become employees or work for anyone else. My daughters will inherit land and be looked after by their husbands or their brothers, so why bother with education? Ran the feudal ethos. My grandfather, however, had seen at first hand the advances being made by the educated Hindus and urban Muslims in Bombay, where he served in the government during the ruling of the British Raj. By educating his own children, Sir Shah Nawaz tried to set an example for the other Sindhi landowners so that after the partition of India in 1947 and the establishment of independent Pakistan, our society would not stagnate. Despite the raised eyebrows of his peers, he sent my father abroad to study. My father had not disappointed him, graduating with honors from the University of California at Berkeley and then going on to read law at Christ Church, Oxford, and being called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn before returning to Pakistan to practice law. My mother, on the other hand, came from the new class of urban industrialists whose views were more cosmopolitan than those of the land-owning class, while the Bhutto women still lived in Barda, rarely allowed to leave the four walls of their compounds and then completely covered in black burqas. My mother and her sisters went around Karachi without veils and drove their own cars. The daughters of an Iranian businessman, they had gone to college and after the birth of Pakistan even served as officials in the National Guard, a paramilitary force of women. Such public exposure would have been impossible for the Bhutto woman. After my mother and father married in 1951, my mother entered Barda with the other Bhutto women and at first was allowed to leave the compound only once a week to visit her family, but the old ways were getting tiresome to everyone. When my grandmother wanted to leave the family compound in Karachi and there was no driver available, she often asked my mother to drive her. When the family went to Al Murtaza, my father insisted on staying with my mother in the women's wing instead of returning to the men's quarter. And when 70 Clifton was built, there was no separate quarters provided for the women, though my grandfather bought a house opposite to meet his male visitors. A new and more enlightened generation was taking root in Pakistan. In our male-dominated culture, boys had always been favored over girls and were not only more often given an education, but in extreme instances were given food first while the mother-daughters waited. In our family, however, there is no discrimination at all. If anything, I received the most attention. The oldest of four, I was born in Karachi on June 21st, 1953, my skin evidently so rosy that I was immediately nicknamed Pinky. My brother Amir Murtaza was born a year after me, Sanam in 1957, and the baby Shah Nawaz in 1958. As the firstborn, I held a special and sometimes lonely place in the family from the beginning. I was only 4 and my father 28 when he was first sent to the United Nations by the President Iskandar Mirza. My father's subsequent government posts as Commerce Minister under President Ayub Khan, then as Minister of Energy, Foreign Minister, and leader of Pakistan's delegation to the United Nations off and on for 7 years, kept him and my mother away from home much of the time. I saw my father as much on the front pages of the newspapers as in person, arguing for Pakistan and other third world countries at the United Nations, negotiating financial and technical assistance agreements with the Soviet Union in 1968, returning from forbidden Peking in 1963 with a border treaty peacefully ceding 750 square miles of disputed territory to Pakistan. My mother usually traveled with him, leaving the children at home with the household staff and me. Look after the other children's, my parents would charge me. You are the oldest. I was only 8 or so when I was left nominally in charge of the house when my parents were away. My mother would give me the money for food and household supplies, which I hid under my pillow. Though I was just learning my sums at school, every night in her absence I would climb on a stool in the kitchen and pretend to go over the accounts with Babu, our longtime loyal major domo. Whether the figures tallied, I have no recollection. Luckily, very small sums were involved. At that point, rupees 10, about $2, bought food for the whole household. In our house, education was top priority. Like his father before him, my father wanted to make examples out of us, the next generation of educated and progressive Pakistanis. At 3, I was sent to Lady Jennings Nursery School, then at 5 to one of the top schools in Karachi, the Convent of Jesus and Mary. Instruction at CJM was in English, the languages we spoke at home more often than my parents' native languages of Sindhi or Persian or the national language of Urdu. And though the Irish nuns who taught were divided the older students into houses with inspirational names like discipline, courtesy, endeavor, and service, they made no effort to convert us to Christianity. The school was too good a source of income for the missionaries who ran it to risk alienating the small number of Muslim families rich enough and farsighted enough to educate the children. I ask only one thing of you, that you do well in your studies, my father told us time and again. As we grew older, he hired tutors to instruct us in math and English in the afternoons after school, and he kept track of our school reports by phone from wherever he was in the world. Luckily, I was a good student, for he had great plans for me to be the first woman in the Bhutto family to study abroad. You will all pack your suitcases and I will take you to the airport to see you off, he started saying to the 4 of us as early as I can remember. Pinky will leave as a scruffy little kid and come back a beautiful young lady in a sari. Shahnawaz will pack so many clothes his suitcase won't close. We will have to call Babu and ask him to sit on it. There was no question in my family that my sister and I would be given the same opportunities in life as my brother, nor was there in Islam. We learned at an early age that it was men's interpretation of our religion that restricted women's opportunities, not our religion itself. Islam, in fact, has been quite progressive towards women from its inception. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had forbidden the killing of female infants common among the Arabs of the time and called for education for women and their right to inherit long before these privileges were granted to them in the West. Bibi Khadija, the first convert to Islam, was a widow who ran her own business, employed the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he was a young boy, and later married him. Umara fought alongside the men in the Muslims' early battles against their enemies, her powerful sword arm saving the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. John Bibi, the female ruler of the South Indian state of Ahmadnagar, defeated the Mughal Emperor Akbar and forced him to enter into a peace treaty with her. Noor Jahan, the wife of Emperor Jahangir and the virtual ruler of India, was famous for her skill in the field of administration. Muslim history was full of women who had taken a public role and performed every bit as successfully as men. Nothing in Islam discouraged them or me from pursuing that course. I have found a woman ruling over them, and she has been given abundance of all things, and hers is a mighty throne, reads the Surah of the Ant in the Holy Quran. To men is allotted what they earn, and to women what they earn, reads the Women's Surah. Every afternoon we read these and other surahs from our holy book with the Maulvi who came to the house after our academic tutoring to give us religious instructions. Reading the Holy Quran in Arabic and understanding its lessons was the most important subject of all. We spent hours struggling over the difficult Arabic, whose alphabet was similar to the one we used in Urdu, but which had totally different grammar and meanings, like the differences between English and French. Paradise lies at the feet of the mother, our Maulvi taught us during those afternoons, citing the Quranic injunction always to be kind to one's parents and to obey them. Not surprisingly, it was an instruction my mother would often use to keep us in line. The Maulvi taught us, too, that our actions on earth would determine our destiny in the afterlife. We will have to cross above a valley of fire, and the bridge will be a hair. Do you know how thin a hair is? He said with great drama. Those who have committed sin will fall into the fire of hell and burn, whereas those who have been good will cross into paradise where milk and honey flows like water. It was my mother, however, who taught me the rituals of prayer. She took her faith very seriously. No matter where she was in the world or what she was doing, she prostrated herself 5 times a day in prayer. When I was 9 years old, she began to include me, slipping into my bedroom to lead me in the morning prayer. Together we would perform the wuzu, the washing of our hands, feet, and faces, so that we could be pure before God, then prostrate ourselves facing west towards Mecca. My mother was a Shia Muslim, as are most Iranis, while the rest of the family was Sunni. But that was never a problem. Shias and Sunnis have lived side by side and intermarried for over 1,000 years, and our differences were far fewer than our similarities. What was fundamental was that all Muslims, regardless of their sex, surrendered to the will of God and believed that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his last prophet. This is the Quranic definition of a Muslim, and in our family, what mattered most. During Muharram, the month commemorating the massacre of the Prophet's grandson, Imam Hussein, at Karbala in Iraq, I would sometimes dress all in black and go with my mother to join other women in the Shia rituals. Follow closely, Mummy would say to me, for the Shia ceremonies were more elaborate than those of the Sunnis. I never took my eyes off the speaker, who dramatically recaptured the tragedy that befell Imam Hussein and a small band of followers at Karbala, where they were ambushed and brutally slaughtered by the troops of the usurper Yazid. No one was spared, not even the little children who fell under Yazid's knife. Imam Hussein was beheaded, and his sister Zainab was made to walk bareheaded to Yazid's court, where she watched the tyrant play with the head of her brother. But instead of allowing her spirit to be broken, Bibi Zainab began filling with resolve, as did the other followers of Imam Hussein. Their descendants, now known today as the Shias, never let themselves forget the tragedy of the Karbala. Hear the little baby cry for water, the speaker called out, her voice filled with emotion. Feel the heart of the mother hearing the cry of her child. Look at the handsome man on the horse going for the water. He bends by the river. We see him bending. Look, look, men are attacking them with swords. As she spoke, some of the women performed the matam, striking their chests in anguish. The vivid recounting of the story was very moving, and I often cried. My father was determined to bring this country and his children into the 20th century. Will the children marry into the family? I overheard my mother ask my father one day. I held my breath for his answer. I don't want the boys to marry their cousins and leave them behind our compound walls any more than I want my daughters buried alive behind some other relative's compound walls, he said to my great relief. Let them finish their education first, then we can decide what to do with their lives. His reaction was just as welcome the day my mother covered me in a burqa for the first time. We had been on the train from Karachi to Larkana when my mother took the black gauzy cloth out of her bag and draped it over me. You are no longer a child, she told me with a tinge of regret. As she performed this age-old rite of passage for the daughters of conservative land-owning families, I passed from childhood into the world of the adult. But what a disappointing world it turned out to be. The colors of the sky, the grass, the flowers were gone, muted and grayish. Everything was blurred by the pattern over my eyes. As I got off the train, the fabric which covered me from head to toe made it difficult to walk. Shut off from whatever breeze there might be, the sweat began to pour down my face. Pinky wore her burqa for the first time today, my mother told my father when we reached Al Murtaza. There was a long pause. She doesn't need to wear it, my father finally said. The Prophet himself said that the best veil is the veil behind the eyes. Let her be judged by her character and her mind, not by her clothing. And I became the first Bhutto woman to be released from a life spent in perpetual twilight. My father always encouraged me to feel part of the greater world, though sometimes his lessons went over my head. I was traveling with him in the foreign minister's private railway carriage in the autumn of 1963 when he shook me awake. This is no time to sleep, he said urgently. There has been a great tragedy. The young president of the United States has been shot. Though I was only 10 and had heard only vaguely of the U.S. president, he made me stay by his side while he received the latest bulletins on the condition of President John F. Kennedy, a man whom he'd met several times at the White House and whom he admired for his liberal social views. Occasionally, he took my brothers, sisters, and me to meet the foreign delegations visiting Pakistan. When he told us one day that we were to meet some important men from China, I was very excited. My father had often spoke highly of the Chinese Revolution and its leader Mao Zedong, who had led his army through the mountains and deserts to throw out the old order. I was sure one of the men was going to be Mao, whose cap A personal gift from the Chinese Revolutionary was hung up in my father's dressing room. For once, I didn't mind being dressed up in the outfits my father brought back every year from Saks Fifth Avenue in New York, where the sales lady kept our measurements. But I was quite disappointed when the important Chinese men did not include Mao, but the Premier of China, Xiao En-lei, and two of his ministers, Chen Yi and Liu Shaoxi, who would subsequently die in jail during the Cultural Revolution. Xiao En-lei wasn't the only important guest in Karachi who didn't match up to my expectations, but we didn't actually meet this one. We knew a VIP must be coming to dinner because the outside of the house was covered with strings of lights. When a limousine drove through the gates, we peered from the upstairs window to see President Ayub Khan, an American gentleman, entering 70 Clifton. I recognized the American immediately from the films we had seen in town. Did you enjoy meeting Bob Hope? I nonchalantly asked my mother the next morning. Who? My mother asked. Bob Hope, I said. You silly, she said to me. That was the Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey. Later, I found out that Hubert Humphrey was trying to elicit Pakistan's support for America and Vietnam in the mild form of supplying badminton rackets for the U.S. troops. But my father refused even that gesture, being morally opposed to any foreign involvement in Vietnam Civil War. When I was 10 and Sanam 11, we were sent north to boarding school in the pine-covered former British hill station of Murray. Our governess had given very short notice and was returning to England. Boarding school seemed the quick solution, and my father was in favor of it, thinking the experience would toughen us up. For the first time, I had to make my own bed, polish my shoes, carry water for bathing, and toothbrushing back and forth from the water taps in the corridors. Treat my children like the others, my father had told the nuns, and they certainly did, laying the brush on Sonny and me for any infringement of the strict rules. At Murray, my father continued our political education by mail. Shortly after he returned from the summit of non-aligned countries in Jakarta, he wrote us a long letter elaborating on the self-interest of the superpowers in the United Nations and the resulting neglect of third world countries. One of the nuns sat Sanam and me down on a bench in the school garden and read the letter to us in its entirety, though we understood little of its content. During our second and last year at Murray, Sanam and I learned some political lessons at first hand. On September 6, 1965, India and Pakistan went to war over Kashmir. While my father flew off to the United Nations to argue for the right of self-determination for the people of Kashmir and against the aggression of India, the nuns of the Covenant of Jesus and Mary prepared their students for the possibility of an Indian invasion. The road to Kashmir ran right through Murray, a clear invitation most people thought for Indian troops to use it to march into Pakistan. Where once we had played jacks with goat bones after dinner or read Enid Blyton books, now suddenly we had air raid practices and blackouts. The nuns made older girls responsible for getting their younger sisters into the shelters, and I made Sunny tie her slippers to her feet at night so she wouldn't lose time in looking for them. Many of our schoolmates were daughters of prominent government officials or army officials, and with excitement we gave each other false names and practiced them in case we fell into the hands of our enemies. In the flush of adolescence, we were all quite dramatic about the possibility of being kidnapped and carried off into the hills. But for the 17th day of the war, the threat of invasion was quite real and frightening. The United States was making the situation in Pakistan even more difficult. Alarmed to find that the arms they had provided Pakistan against a communist threat were being used instead against India, the Johnson administration imposed an arms embargo on the entire subcontinent. But India was also getting arms from the Soviet Union, and Pakistan wasn't. Despite this handicap, our soldiers fought successfully right up to the time of the ceasefire called by the United Nations on September 23rd. The country felt triumphant. Not only had we repulsed the Indian attack, but we had taken more of their territory than they had of ours. Our elation was short-lived. During the peace negotiations held in the southern Russian city of Tashkent, President Ayub Khan lost everything we had gained on the battlefield. Under the Tashkent Agreement, both countries agreed to pull their troops back to their pre-war positions. My father was disgusted and tendered his resignation as foreign minister. When the Indian Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died of a heart attack the day after the agreement was signed, my father acidly remarked that he must have died from happiness. As the terms of the settlement were disclosed to the people, massive demonstrations erupted by the provinces of Punjab and Sindh amidst reports of police brutality. Still, the demonstrations continued, and the lives of the Bhuttos were changed forever. In June 1966, Ayub finally accepted my father's resignation. The differences between Ayub and my father were now in the open, and the groundswell of popular support for my father as a political leader soared. On our last ride home to Larkana in the foreign minister's private railway carriage, the crowds were frenzied, running along the trail, hurling themselves towards the handrails to try and ride alongside us. Fakar-e-Asia Zindabad, long live the pride of Asia, the crowd roared, climbing on the top of the train and running along the tops of buildings by the track. Bhutto Zindabad, long live Bhutto. I was terrified in Lahore where my father left the train to have a luncheon meeting with the governor of Punjab. There's blood on Mr. Bhutto's shirt, someone cried out. My heart froze until I saw my father return through the crowd smiling and waving. His shirt was torn and he had a small scratch, but nothing more. His tie was gone as well. I heard later that it was auctioned for thousands of rupees. When he got back into the foreign minister's carriage, the crowd started rocking the train, the momentum growing until I thought we would come off the rails. Safely back at home, the talk turned to politics even more. Terms such as Cold War and arms embargo had already become part of our dimly understood vocabulary as small children. We were as familiar with hearing the results of roundtable conferences and summit meetings as other children were with World Cup cricket scores. But after my father broke with Ayub Khan in 1966, the words civil liberties and democracy were the ones that came up most, words which were mythical to most Pakistanis who had only experienced restricted political participation under Ayub. Until my father formed his own political party in 1967, the Pakistani People's Party. Roti, kapra, makhan, bread, clothing, shelter. These simple promises became the rallying cry for the Pakistan People's Party, fundamentals which the millions of poor in Pakistan did not have. Whereas all Muslims prostrated themselves before Allah, the poor in our country still prostrated themselves before the rich. Stand up, do not grovel before others. You are human beings and have rights, my father exhorted the crowds in the most remote and forlorn villages of Pakistan where no politician had traveled before. Call for democracy where the vote of the poorest carries the same weight as the vote of the richest. Who is Bhutto? Who is Bhutto? Why do people say that everyone is coming to hear him when only Tonga drivers, rickshaw drivers, and Riri drivers are at his public meetings? Ayub Khan's governor questioned in the government-controlled press. As an idealist, I was shocked. Though we were living sheltered lives and attending privileged schools, I had seen people without shoes, without shirts, young girls with matted hair and thin babies. Did the poor not even count as people? We knew from our Quranic studies that everyone in Islam was equal in the eyes of God. We had also been taught by our parents to treat everyone with respect and not to allow anyone to prostrate himself before us, to touch our feet, or to back out of our presence. There is no law of God that we here in Pakistan alone should be poor. My father continued to argue to the masses of poor and increasingly to the groups of women standing shyly on the edges of the crowds. Our country is rich. It has many resources. Why then should there be poverty, hunger, and disease? It was a question people would readily understand. Ayub's promised economic restructuring of Pakistan's economy had failed, while his family and a handful of others had become rich. In the 11 years of Ayub's rule, a group known familiarity as Pakistan's 22 families had established practically every bank, insurance company, and major industry in Pakistan. The outrage drew hundreds, then thousands of people to hear my father's call for social and economic reform. The first floor of our house at 70 Clifton, Karachi, began to serve as a branch office of the PPP. At 11 and 14, my sister and I enthusiastically paid the 4 anna dues to join the party so that we too could help our Major Domo Babu sign up the increasing numbers of people who lined up at the gates every day. But in the midst of our normal recountings of our days, who had won at netball or cricket, we also began to hear my father's accounts of the bribes offered him by the Ayub regime. You are young with your whole life ahead of you. Let Ayub have his turn, and later you have yours. Work with us rather than against us, and we will make things very easy for you. Ayub and his colleagues were telling my father exactly the same words I would hear later from the envoys of another dictator. When Ayub's offers of bribery failed to silence my father, death threats began. The world of violence was unknown to me then. There was the world of politics in which my father lived, and then there was the world of children, schools and games, laughter at the beach. But the two worlds collided when news of armed attacks against my father began to come in. Ayub supporters fired on him at Yar, Rahim Yar Khan, Sangar, and other stops on his tour to popularize the PPP. Thankfully, the assassins missed. At Sangar, my father's life had been saved by his supporters, who threw themselves over him and suffered injuries from the bullets themselves. Our house became filled with tension, but I tried not to show my fear. What good would it have done? This was the stuff of political life in Pakistan, and therefore the life we led. Death, threats, corruption, violence. What was. I didn't even allow myself to feel frightened. I tried, in fact, not to feel anything at all, even when 11 months after the founding of the Pakistan People's Party, Ayub arrested my father and the other senior party leaders and threw them in jail. That was the way of dictators. Where there is protest, crush it. Where there are dissenters, arrest them. Under what law? We are the law. The violent events of 1968 were not restricted to Pakistan. A revolutionary fever was sweeping the world. Students rioting on campus in Paris, Tokyo, Mexico, Berkeley, as well as Rawalpindi. In Pakistan, the rioting against Ayub spread with the news that my father had been arrested and taken to Mianwala, one of the worst prisons in Pakistan. It continued when he was transferred to Sihawal, where his cell was infested with rats. In an effort to quell the disturbances, the regime closed down all schools and universities. Meanwhile, I was facing the most critical time of my academic life, preparing for my O-level exams, which covered the last 3 years of my studies, as well as for my SATs, achievements, and my entrance exam for possible admission to Radcliffe. I'd begged my father to let me apply to Berkeley, where he had gone, but he wouldn't let me. The weather in California is too nice, he had explained. The snow and ice in Massachusetts will force you to study. There was no question of my not taking the exams, since they were sent from England only once a year in December. You stay in Karachi and study, my mother said, taking the younger children with her to Lahore to file a petition of habeas corpus in the High Court against my father's detention. I was left alone at 70 Clifton, confined to the immediate area, a long way from the commercial center where the rioting was taking place. To distract myself from worrying about my father in prison, I buried myself in my work, going over and over my subjects with the tutors who came to the house every day. In the evenings, I sometimes joined my friends Fifi, Tamanna, Fatima, and Sumaya at the nearby Sindh Club, once a British enclave where natives and dogs were not allowed, and now a sporting club for well-to-do Pakistanis. We played squash and swam in the pool, though we all knew things were not as carefree as they seemed. Ever since my father started challenging Ayub, some of my friends' relatives and well-wishers had begun cautioning them that friendships with the Bhuttos was dangerous, an invitation to reprisal by Ayub's regime. Sumaya's father had been warned by the Inspector General himself that his daughter's friendship with me could bring trouble to his family. Sumaya and my other friends bravely stuck by me, though I noticed other schoolmates beginning to distance themselves. I'm praying for your success in your O-level examinations, my father wrote from Sahawal prison on November 28th. I'm really proud to have a daughter who is so bright that she is doing O-levels at the young age of 15, 3 years before I did them. At this rate, you might become the president. Though he was being held in solitary confinement, my father led me to believe that his major concern continued to be my education. I know you read a great deal, but you should read a little more literature and history, his letter continued. You have all the books you need. Read about Napoleon Bonaparte, the most complete man of modern history. Read about the American Revolution, about Abraham Lincoln. Read 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed. Read about Bismarck and Lenin, Ataturk and Mao Zedong. Read the history of India from ancient times, and above all, read the history of Islam. The prison form was signed Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. I wanted more than anything to be in Lahore with my family, but I couldn't. Sanam rang to tell me that my mother was leading women in protest marches against my father's imprisonment every 2 or 3 days, making sure each demonstrator carried a wet towel and a plastic bag in case Ayub's riot police fired tear gas. Several times the police broke up the processions with bamboo lathis, yet the demonstrations were continuing to grow. Ayub ordered the military out to arrest the protesters, but the soldiers refused to arrest the women, waving at them instead. Even under Ayub, women were still considered sacrosanct. When the time for the O-level exam finally came in December, the Covenant of Jesus and Mary arranged for us to take the test at the Vatican Embassy, also in Clifton. Its sanctity and its distance from the commercial center of Karachi made it the safest choice. While students in Britain sat their several days of exams in tidy classrooms, we were slipped in and out of Pakistan's headquarters at the Church of Rome. Meanwhile, the rioting continued, the anger against Ayub mounting after the police fired on the demonstrations, killing several. Now rioters all over Pakistan began calling for Ayub's resignation as well as the release of my father and the other political prisoners. 3 months after my father's arrest, the chaos in Pakistan forced Ayub Khan to let the PPP leaders go. Amidst rumors that the plane that was to bring my father home to Larkana from Lahore would be sabotaged and my father killed, supposedly by accident, my mother held a press conference to expose the possible plot before it could be carried out. My father was brought to Larkana by train instead. I have never been so happy to see anyone in my life, but the struggle against Ayub was far from over. Get down, my father shouted at Sanam and me during a victory march in Larkana soon after his release, while our open car moved slowly through the mobs cheering Jai Bhutto and Girti ho Diwar ko akhri taka do. Give the falling wall a final push, and Ayub agent fired point blank at my father. Miraculously, the pistol jammed, but the crowd was unforgiving. I peeked out from under my father's hand to see a young man literally being torn apart. His neck, his head, his arms and legs were being pulled apart in different directions, as was his mouth, which was bleeding heavily. Don't look, my father said sharply, pushing me down harder. I hunched over my knees while my father shouted at the crowd to let his would-be assassin live. Reluctantly, they did so, but the sight stayed with me for months. So did the sight of my father wasting away on a hunger strike and his continuing protests against Ayub's dictatorship and powers of arbitrary arrest. For days after his release from prison, he sat under a shamiana at Al Murtaza with other PPP leaders in full view of the street. Al Larkana watched and grew frightened as he got thinner and thinner. Please give in to Papa, I silently wailed Ayub Khan, wondering why the men sitting with my father looked so well. They order food when they are in their rooms at night. One of the staff confided to me, don't tell your father. Like mushrooms, hunger strike groups sprang up in front of the bar associations and the busy streets of cities all across Pakistan. Large crowds gathered every day to give the hunger strikers moral support and call for Ayub's resignation. Realizing that even his police could not control the situation, Ayub finally stepped down on March 25, 1969. But the victory was hollow. Instead of passing power to the Speaker of the National Assembly as laid down in his own constitution, Ayub designated his Army Chief of Staff Yahya Khan the new leader of Pakistan. Once again, Pakistan was under the grip of a military dictator who promptly suspended all civil law and imposed martial rule. You have a letter for Radcliffe, my mother told me in April. From Radcliffe. I took the envelope from her with misgivings. Did I really want to go? The college had cautioned my father that at 16 I would be too young to enter Radcliffe and had suggested that I wait a year, but my father saw no reason to hold me back. Instead, he had asked the help of his friend, John Kenneth Galbraith, a professor of economics at Harvard and the former U.S. ambassador to India. I opened the envelope. I had been accepted for the autumn of 1969. My father gave me a beautiful volume of the Holy Quran bound in mother of pearl as a going-away present. You will see many things that surprise you in America, and some that may shock you, he said, but I know you have the ability to adapt. Above all, you must study hard. Very few in Pakistan have the opportunity you now have, and you must take advantage of it. Never forget that the money it is costing to send you comes from the land, from the people who sweat and toil on those lands. You will owe a debt to them, a debt you can repay with God's blessing by using your education to better their lives. In late August, I stood in the carved wooden doorway of 70 Clifton while my mother passed my new Holy Quran over my head. I kissed it, and together we left for the airport to fly to the United States.